The words hit her before she even reached the door. Nobody important, the Alpha King said, his voice flat and dismissive, the way someone might describe a piece of furniture they had already forgotten buying. A ward of the keep. She tends the kennels. Sable froze in the corridor, her hand still raised to knock, her knuckles an inch from the wood. Through the gap in the door she could see him, King Kale Voss, seated behind his war desk with his back half-turned, addressing a visiting dignitary who had apparently asked who the woman was that they had seen crossing the courtyard that morning. Nobody important. 3 syllables that shouldn't have meant anything. She had been called worse. Orphans raised inside castle walls learned early that their name was whatever the household decided it was. Burden. Charity case. Useful. On a good day. But hearing it from him, from the man whose hunting wolves she had nursed through distemper and mange and broken bones for 6 years, whose favorite hound she had sat up with for 3 nights straight last winter when it was dying, that landed differently. Something behind her ribs made a sound like a branch snapping under too much snow. Quiet. Final. She lowered her hand. She stood there for 3 full breaths, staring at the grain of the wood, feeling the last 6 years rearrange themselves in her memory. Every late night in the kennels, every fever she had sat through, every wound she had cleaned, every wolf she had coaxed back from terror. All of it, recast in a single sentence. Nobody important. She turned and walked back down the corridor, her boots silent on the stone. She passed the kitchen entrance where afternoon light spilled warm across the floor. She passed the servants' hall where laughter leaked through the door. She passed it all like a ghost, already halfway gone from a place that had never fully seen her. No one noticed. No one called after her. The castle continued its business without so much as a ripple. That was 4 days ago. Now the Alpha King stood in the empty kennels, staring at the hook where her work apron used to hang, and the silence that greeted him was absolute. Every wolf in the den was howling, and they had not stopped since the night she disappeared. The handlers couldn't calm them. The stable masters couldn't get near them. 3 wolves had refused food entirely, and his own bonded wolf, a massive black beast named Fenric, had bitten 2 guards and was now pacing the yard in tight, frantic circles, snarling at anyone who approached. "Where is she?" Kale asked. Brennick, his steward, stood 2 paces behind him, his face carefully neutral. "Gone, Your Majesty. Her quarters are cleared. Her belongings are missing." She left no word. "That is not what I asked." Kale's voice dropped to something low and dangerous. "I asked where she is." Brennick hesitated. "We don't know." The king stared at the empty hook. The apron was a faded thing, patched twice, smelling permanently of cedar oil and wolf fur. He had never noticed it before. He noticed its absence now like a wound. "Find her," he said. He turned and walked out of the kennels. Behind him, the wolves kept howling. 6 years earlier, a girl of 17 had been reassigned from the kitchens to the kennels because no one else wanted the job. The previous kennel keeper had quit after being bitten for the 4th time, and the wolves, half feral and deeply mistrustful of humans, were considered too dangerous for most of the household staff. Sable hadn't volunteered. She had been told. The head cook had pointed at her and said, "You, kennels, starting tomorrow." And that had been that. She had walked into the wolf den on her first morning expecting teeth. What she found instead were animals so neglected and frightened they had forgotten what kindness felt like. Their coats were matted. Their water was stale. 2 of the younger wolves had infections in their paws that had gone untreated for weeks. Sable sat on the stone floor of the den, said nothing, and waited. It took 3 days before the first wolf approached her. A scarred female with 1 torn ear who pressed her nose against Sable's knee and exhaled like she was letting go of something heavy. After that, the others followed. Within a year, the kennels were unrecognizable. The wolves were healthy, their coats gleaming, their temperaments steady. Sable had learned their names, their habits, their fears. She knew which ones needed space and which ones craved contact. She knew that Fenric, the king's bonded wolf, would only eat from a copper bowl, and that he liked to be scratched behind his left ear, but never his right. She had built something real in that place, something quiet and necessary and invisible to everyone who benefited from it. The wolves hunted better, guarded better, responded to commands with a precision that the king's huntsmen took credit for, without ever wondering why the animals had improved so dramatically. Sable never corrected them. She had learned long ago that invisible work stayed safe. The moment someone noticed you, they could decide you were a problem. Better to be essential and unseen than visible and disposable. And then, on a gray morning in late autumn, she heard 3 words through a cracked door, and the careful invisibility she had spent 6 years maintaining revealed itself for what it had always been. Not safety. Just loneliness with a different name. Nobody important. She was gone before nightfall. She left nothing behind except clean kennels, a carefully written feeding schedule pinned to the wall, and wolves that wouldn't stop crying. Kale had not slept in 2 days. This was not unusual for a king in wartime, but there was no war. There was only the relentless, grating absence of a woman he had barely thought about before she vanished, and could not stop thinking about now that she was gone. The wolves were getting worse. Fenric had stopped eating entirely and spent his nights pressed against the door of the empty kennel quarters, whining in a pitch that carried through the stone walls and into the king's own chambers 3 floors above. The sound burrowed into Kale's skull and sat there, a thin, needling ache that no amount of work or distraction could dull. "She's a kennel keeper," he told Brennick on the 3rd morning, standing in the great hall with maps spread across the table that had nothing to do with the problem at hand. "People don't just vanish. Someone must have seen her leave." "The North Gate Guard recalls a woman matching her description passing through at dusk 4 days ago," Brennick reported. "Traveling alone, carrying a single bag. He didn't stop her. She wasn't a prisoner." That last sentence sat in the air between them like an accusation. "Send riders," Kale ordered. Brennick hesitated, choosing his words with the caution of a man who had learned exactly where the line was between useful counsel and insubordination. "Your Majesty, the council will ask questions. Dispatching riders for a kennel keeper is unprecedented. It will raise eyebrows." "Is that supposed to concern me?" Kale's gaze snapped to him, sharp enough to draw blood. "It will draw attention," Brennick said, standing his ground. "The kind of attention that invites speculation." "Then let it," the king said, and something in his voice, something raw and unfamiliar, made the steward take a step back. In 15 years of service, Brennick had never heard that particular note in his king's voice before. It sounded dangerously close to desperation. 3 riders left that afternoon. They returned 2 days later with nothing. No trail, no sightings, no word from any village or outpost within a day's ride. Sable had walked out of the castle and dissolved into the landscape like smoke into fog. Kale stood in the kennel yard that evening, watching Fenric pace. The wolf's ribs were starting to show beneath his dark coat. He moved in those same tight, desperate circles, nose to the ground, searching for a scent that was fading more with each passing hour. "I know," Kale murmured, crouching low. He reached out a hand. Fenric snarled at him. The king's own wolf, his bonded companion since he was a boy of 14, bared its teeth at him and backed away. Kale pulled his hand back slowly. The rejection landed harder than it should have. Fenric had never snarled at him before, not once in 15 years. But the wolf didn't see his king right now. He saw the reason Sable was gone. That night, alone in his chambers, the king sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms against his eyes. The howling had become a constant, a chorus that rose and fell like breathing, filling every corridor and stairwell of the keep. The household staff moved through the halls with their shoulders hunched and their faces tight. 2 kitchen maids had already asked to be relocated to the lower quarters, further from the sound. "She's nobody," he said into the dark, testing the words. They tasted wrong. They had always tasted wrong, he realized, and the realization made something cold settle in his chest. He thought about the winter before, Fenric had fallen ill, a rattling cough that deepened into something wet and terrible over the course of 3 days. The healers had said it would pass. It didn't pass. On the third night, Kale had gone down to the kennels to check on the wolf and found Sable already there, sitting on the floor beside Fenric with his enormous head in her lap, her fingers working slow circles behind his left ear. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She had been crying. She hadn't seen the king standing in the doorway. She had been talking to the wolf in a low, steady voice, telling him he was going to be fine, that she wouldn't let anything happen to him, that she was right here, and she wasn't going anywhere. Kale had stood there for a long time, watching her, feeling something he couldn't name shift behind his ribs. The candlelight had caught the side of her face, and he remembered thinking she looked tired, the kind of tired that went deeper than sleep could fix, the kind that came from pouring yourself out for years and never being refilled. He remembered thinking he should say something. Thank you, perhaps. Or just her name, spoken aloud in a way that acknowledged she was a person and not a function. He didn't. He told himself it wasn't appropriate. That a king didn't linger in doorways thanking servants for doing their jobs. That acknowledging her would create complications, expectations, attachments he wasn't prepared to examine. The truth was simpler than that, and uglier. He didn't say anything because saying something would have meant admitting she mattered, and admitting she mattered would have meant examining why, and Kale was not ready for what he would find if he pulled that thread. So he turned and walked away without saying a word. And the moment passed, and he let it pass, and now it was gone. He had never thanked her. Not once in 6 years. He had never acknowledged what she did. Never asked her name in front of anyone who mattered. Never treated her as anything more than a quiet, reliable piece of the household machinery. And when someone asked who she was, he had called her nobody important, because that was easier than examining why her presence in his home had started to feel necessary in ways that kept him up at night. The howling outside his window grew louder, a sound like grief given voice by creatures who didn't know how to grieve quietly. Kale lay back on his bed, stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep. On the 7th day, Fenric collapsed. The wolf lay on his side in the kennel yard, his breathing shallow and labored, his dark coat dull against the cold stone. The other wolves had gone silent at last, arranged in a loose circle around him, their heads low, watching with an animal solemnity that made Kale's throat constrict. He knelt beside Fenric, his hand on the wolf's flank. He could feel the ribs beneath the fur, sharp and prominent where there had once been solid muscle. The bond between them, the deep, instinctive thread that connected an alpha to his wolf, pulsed faintly, weakly, like a heartbeat losing its rhythm. "How long?" Kale asked without looking up. Ulvin, the court physician, stood a careful distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. "Days, perhaps. A week at most. The animal isn't ill in any way I can identify. He simply stopped. He won't eat, won't drink, barely moves. It's as though something essential has been removed from him, and without it he sees no reason to continue." "He's grieving," Kale said quietly, and the word surprised him even as it left his mouth. Ulvin shifted uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, wolves don't—" "He is grieving," Kale repeated, and the physician went silent. Kale looked down at Fenric's face. The wolf's eyes were half open, glassy and distant, staring at nothing. One of the younger wolves, a gray female sable had named Thistle, crept forward on her belly and pressed her muzzle against Fenric's neck, whimpering softly. The sound was so raw, so plainly heartbroken, that Kale had to look away. Something cracked open inside the king's chest. Not all at once, but slowly, the way ice fractures on a river in early spring, beginning with a single line that spreads outward until the whole surface is webbed with breaks. He had done this, not with cruelty, not with intention, but with indifference. With the casual, unconscious dismissal of a person who had poured herself into his household, his wolves, his life, and received nothing in return. Not a word of thanks, not a glance of recognition, Not even the dignity of a name when someone asked who she was. Nobody important. He could feel it now, the shape of what he had lost, visible only in its absence, like a missing tooth the tongue keeps finding. "Brennick," Cale called, his voice rough. The steward appeared in the doorway instantly, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "Expand the search. Every village, every outpost, every road within 3 days' ride. I want her description at every inn and trading post from here to the northern pass." "Your Majesty," and send for the trackers, Cale continued, rising to his feet. "Not the household trackers, the Greymane brothers, the ones who found the deserters in the Black Fen last year." Brennick's eyebrows rose fractionally. The Greymanes were expensive, notoriously difficult, and only took jobs that interested them. They were also the best trackers in the kingdom. "The Greymanes charge a considerable fee," Brennick said carefully. "I don't care what they charge." "And if the council inquires about the expense?" Cale looked at him, and whatever Brennick saw in the king's face made him close his mouth, nod once, and leave without another word. The Greymane brothers arrived 3 days later. Haddon and Jorik, twin trackers with wolf blood in their line and noses sharp enough to follow a scent through rain. They examined Sable's quarters, the kennels, the path to the north gate, crouching periodically to press their fingertips against the stone. "She's smart," Haddon told the king that evening, his voice carrying the grudging respect of a professional recognizing competence in an unexpected place. "Walked through the river for the first mile out, doubled back twice, changed direction at least 3 times before committing northeast." "She didn't want to be found," Jorik added quietly. Those words landed like a fist to the sternum. Of course she didn't want to be found. She had heard what he thought of her, and she had made a decision. A clean, permanent decision. "Can you track her?" Cale asked. "We can try," Haddon said. "But the trail is 10 days old now. Rain would have washed most of it. And if she kept using water to cover her path?" He trailed off, shrugging with one shoulder. "Try," Cale said. They left at dawn. Cale stood at the north gate and watched them disappear into the tree line, and the feeling in his chest was something he had never experienced before. A pulling sensation, deep and directional, like a compass needle swinging toward true north. It had been building for days, so gradually he hadn't recognized it for what it was. But standing there, watching the trackers vanish between the trees, he felt it clearly at last. Something in him was reaching for something out there. Something specific. Something north. He pressed his fist against his sternum and frowned. That night, Fenric lifted his head. It was the first sign of life he had shown in days. The wolf's nostrils flared, testing the air with short, urgent pulls. His ears rotated forward. For one breathless moment his eyes sharpened and something alive flickered behind them. Then his head dropped back to the ground and the light dimmed again, as though whatever he had been searching for wasn't there. Cale sat beside him in the dark kennel, his back against the cold wall, and made a decision that he knew would shake the court and might shake the kingdom. "When they find her," he said quietly, his hand resting on the wolf's neck, feeling the faint, fading pulse beneath the fur, "I will go myself." Fenric's ear twitched toward the sound of his voice. But the wolf did not lift his head again. The Greymane brothers returned on the second day, and Cale knew before they spoke that the news was bad. It was written in the way Haddon wouldn't meet his eyes, and the way Jorik kept his hands in his pockets, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't want to release. "We tracked her northeast for 2 days, Haddon reported, standing in the king's study with mud still caked on his boots. "Through the river valley, past the thornwood, into the hill country beyond. The trail was faint but readable. She's good at covering her tracks, but she's not a tracker herself. She made mistakes." He paused. Cale waited, the tightness behind his sternum winding like wire around a post. "She crossed into the Ashenmoor," Jorik said. The room went very still. The Ashenmoor was borderland in the truest sense, unclaimed territory between the kingdom's northern edge and the wildlands beyond. No patrols, no settlements, no law. The terrain was brutal, fog-choked ravines and shale ridges and bogs that could swallow a horse without warning. The few people who lived out there were exiles and outcasts who had run out of places to run. No one went into the Ashenmoor voluntarily. Certainly not alone. Certainly not in late autumn with winter bearing down. "You're certain?" Cale asked, though the ache in his bones had already confirmed it. The direction was right. North and east. Into the gray. "We followed the trail to the edge," Haddon said. 3 miles in, we lost it entirely. The moor swallows everything. Scent, tracks, sound. It's like the land itself doesn't want to be read. "We can go deeper," Jorik offered, though his voice carried the honest reluctance of a man who knew what he was volunteering for. "But we'd need supplies, backup, and even then, the Ashenmoor has killed better woodsmen than us." "No," Cale said. "You've done enough." He paid them generously. They left. And Cale stood alone in his study, staring at the map pinned to the wall, at the vast unmarked gray of the Ashenmoor. She had walked into that. Alone. In autumn, with winter closing in. A woman with no pack, no wolf, no weapons beyond whatever she had carried in a single bag. Because he had called her nobody important. The guilt was a physical thing now. It sat in his stomach like a stone, heavy and sharp-edged, grinding against everything else whenever he moved. It gnawed at him when he ate, which he was doing less of. It pressed down when he breathed, which seemed to require more effort than it used to. It clouded everything when he tried to focus on the documents piling up on his desk, the trade agreements and border reports and council minutes that blurred together into meaningless shapes. The kingdom didn't stop needing governance just because its king was falling apart. But Cale found himself reading the same sentences 3 and 4 times over, his eyes sliding off the words, his mind dragged north by a force he couldn't reason with. Brennick noticed. The council noticed. The kitchen staff noticed the untouched plates returning from his chambers. Everyone saw it, but no one said anything, because the king had developed a look in his eyes that discouraged questions. A haunted, restless intensity that made people step aside when he walked through corridors and lower their voices when he entered a room. On the 12th day after Sable's disappearance, Cale made an announcement that stunned the court. "I'm riding north," he told the council, his palms flat on the table, his voice carrying the absolute finality of a man who had already considered every argument against this and dismissed them all. "Brennick will oversee affairs in my absence." No one moved. The air in the room turned heavy. Councillor Marin, a sharp-featured woman who had served 3 kings before Cale, leaned forward in her chair. "Your Majesty, you cannot be serious. The Northern Summit is in 2 weeks. The trade delegation arrives in 10 days. You cannot simply leave the capital on a—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished word hung in the air anyway. "Whim." "I can," Cale said calmly. "And I am." "For what purpose?" Marin pressed, her voice edged with barely concealed frustration. Cale looked at her, and the counselor sat back slightly in her chair. "I'm bringing someone home," he said. Marin's eyes narrowed. "The kennel girl." It wasn't a question. "Her name," Cale said, his voice dropping to a register that made the candle flames on the table shiver, "is Sable. And if anyone in this room calls her the kennel girl again, they will discover exactly how unpleasant their king can be when he chooses." Nobody spoke. He rode out at dawn the next morning with 4 guards, provisions for 2 weeks, and Fenric, who had somehow dragged himself to his feet when he heard the horses being saddled. The wolf was gaunt and unsteady, but his eyes had regained a fraction of their sharpness. When Cale mounted his horse, Fenric pressed against the animal's flank and pointed his nose north. "I know," Cale murmured, adjusting the reins with hands that weren't entirely steady. "I know, boy." They rode hard through the first day, following the Greymanes' route. The landscape shifted from farmland to forest, to rocky, wind-bitten hill country. By nightfall, they had reached the edge of the thornwood, where the trees grew thick and close, and the last light died between the trunks like a held breath being released. They camped that night in a clearing, and Cale sat beside the fire while his guards slept in shifts. The tug behind his sternum had grown stronger with every mile north, a deep, magnetic ache that felt less like instinct and more like instruction. He had felt it before, he realized. Faintly, for months. A vague awareness at the edge of his consciousness that he had dismissed as restlessness or the weight of the crown. But it wasn't any of those things. It had never been any of those things. "Your Majesty," one of the guards said cautiously from across the fire. "Permission to speak freely?" Cale nodded. "The wolf hasn't eaten in 12 days. If we push hard tomorrow, the terrain into the moor will be rough. I'm not sure he'll make it." Cale looked at Fenric. The wolf lay curled near the fire, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Even now, even this broken and diminished, the animal's nose was pointed north. "He'll make it," Cale said quietly. "He has something to get to." The guard didn't argue. On the second day, they reached the Ashen Moor. The change was immediate. The trees vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of gray-green scrub and dark stone. Fog hung low over the ground, dense enough to muffle hoofbeats, and thick enough to erase the world beyond 20 paces. The air smelled of peat and damp earth, and something older, something that set every wolf instinct in Cale's body humming. Fenric stopped at the border. The wolf planted his feet and raised his head, nostrils flaring, pulling scent from the fog with sharp, urgent breaths. His body quivered. His ears snapped forward and locked. Then he surged forward, moving faster than he had in days, his weakened legs finding purchase on the uneven ground with a determination that bordered on reckless. "Follow him," Cale commanded, and they plunged into the moor. The fog swallowed them within minutes. The guards closed ranks, hands on their weapons, eyes scanning the gray nothing that pressed in from every direction. Fenric moved ahead, nose to the ground, weaving between outcrops of dark stone and patches of standing water that reflected the colorless sky like shards of broken mirror. Hours passed. The terrain grew worse, sucking mud, hidden drops, loose stones that shifted underfoot. One of the horses stumbled badly. The fog refused to lift, and the silence beneath it was the wrong kind, not peaceful, but watchful. And then Fenric stopped. The wolf stood rigid, every muscle locked, his tail straight and trembling. A low sound rumbled in his chest, something between a growl and a cry, raw and desperate, and unmistakably hopeful. Cale dismounted and moved forward on foot, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ache was so strong now it was almost painful, a hook buried deep behind his ribs, drawing him forward step by step into the thinning fog. And there, in a shallow hollow between two ridges of black stone, was a small rough shelter built from branches and moorland scrub. A thin thread of smoke rose from a fire pit outside. A drying rack held strips of preserved meat. Tools made from stone and bone were arranged neatly on a flat rock beside a clay pot she must have shaped herself. She had survived. She had built something out here in the nothing, alone, from bare ground and bare hands, the same way she had rebuilt his kennels from nothing. And sitting beside the fire, her back to him, her hands busy mending a torn piece of cloth, was Sable. Fenric broke into a run. The wolf crossed the distance in 3 bounding strides and crashed into her, with enough force to knock her sideways off the log she was sitting on. Sable gasped, her hands flying up in defense, and then her arms came around the wolf's neck, and she buried her face in his fur. A sound escaped her that Cale felt in his own chest, half laugh and half sob, muffled against Fenric's matted coat. "You stupid, stubborn animal," she whispered, her voice cracking on every word. "What are you doing here? Look at you. Look at the state of you." Fenric whimpered and pressed closer, his tail sweeping the ground, his entire wasted body trembling with a relief so visible it hurt to witness. Cale stood at the edge of the hollow and watched. His throat had closed, his hands were shaking at his sides, and the constant ache behind his sternum had gone quiet, replaced by something warm and terrifying and completely still. Sable looked up from the wolf. Their eyes met across the hollow, and every ounce of softness drained from her face. The relief vanished. The tears stopped. What replaced them was something hard and guarded, a wall built fast and high by someone who had learned the hard way what happened when you left yourself open. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was steady, cold, controlled in a way that told him the control was costing her everything. She looked thinner than he remembered, harder. The softness that had once lived in her face had been scraped away by wind and solitude, and whatever it had cost her to survive out here alone for nearly 2 weeks. Her hands were raw and roughened. Her clothes were patched with strips of leather she had cut herself, but her eyes were the same, dark and steady and impossible to hide from. Cale opened his mouth, and for the first time in his life, the Alpha King had absolutely no idea what to say. "I came to bring you back," Cale said. The words came out wrong, too commanding, too certain, as if he still had any right to certainty when it came to her. Sable's expression didn't change. She stayed where she was, one arm still wrapped around Fenric's neck, her fingers buried in the wolf's matted fur. "Back to what?" she asked. The question landed like cold water. Cale opened his mouth, closed it, and realized he didn't have an answer. Back to the kennels? Back to being invisible? Back to a castle where years of devotion earned her dismissal through a cracked door? "The wolves need you," he said instead, grasping for solid ground. "Fenric nearly died. He stopped eating the day you left. The others are—" "I can see what happened to Fenric," Sable interrupted, her voice quiet but edged. She ran her hand along the wolf's protruding ribs, and her jaw tightened. "I can see exactly what happened to him." The accusation was subtle, but it cut deep. She wasn't blaming herself for leaving. She was blaming the castle for not being able to care for the wolves in her absence. She was blaming him. "Sable," Cale started. "You rode 2 days into the Ashenmoor," she said, looking up at him with that unflinching gaze. "For a kennel keeper?" He flinched. The word sounded different in her mouth than it had in his. It sounded like what it was, a reduction, a way of making a person smaller so you didn't have to reckon with their actual size. "No," he said. "I crossed the Ashenmoor for you." Something flickered across her face, fast and unguarded, before the wall came back up. She looked away, pressing her cheek against Fenric's head. "You called me nobody important," she said, and her voice was steady, but the steadiness had a tremor buried deep beneath it, like a foundation that was holding but only just. "I heard you through the door. The dignitary asked who I was, and you said, 'Nobody important.'" The words hung in the cold air between them. "I know," Cale said. "I know what I said." "Then you know why I left." "Yes." Silence settled over the hollow. The guards stood at a respectful distance, their faces carefully blank. The fog pressed in around them, muting everything, turning the world into a small gray room with no walls and no ceiling and no way out except through each other. "Come back," Cale said, and this time his voice cracked on the second word in a way that surprised them both. "Please." Sable looked at him for a long moment. He could see her weighing it, the war behind her eyes between the part of her that wanted to believe him and the part that had been burned too recently to risk the flame again. "Why?" she asked. "So I can go back to being invisible? So I can spend another 6 years loving—" She stopped herself, the word catching in her throat like a fishhook. She swallowed hard and started again. "So I can spend another 6 years pouring myself into a place that doesn't see me?" "I saw you," Cale said, And the confession came out rough and raw and completely unplanned. That night with Fenric, when he was sick, I stood in the doorway and I watched you hold him, and I saw you. I have been seeing you for longer than I knew how to admit. Sable stared at him. Then why didn't you say anything? She whispered. Because I was afraid of what it meant, Kale thought. Because you were the only person in the castle who never wanted anything from me, and I was terrified that if I acknowledged you, I would have to acknowledge why you mattered. And then I would have to do something about it. And I didn't know how. What he said instead was simpler. Because I was a coward. The word sat between them, honest and irreversible. A king calling himself a coward in front of his guards, in front of the woman he had wronged, in the middle of a fog-choked wasteland he had ridden 2 days to reach. Sable's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She pressed her lips together hard and looked down at Fenric, who had fallen asleep against her side, his breathing deeper and steadier than it had been since she left. He needs to eat, she said finally, her voice thick. And he needs water, and warmth, and someone to check his joints because he's been walking on ground that's too cold for too long. I'll have the guards set up camp, Kale offered. Sable nodded without looking at him. I'm not coming back to the castle, she said, and the words hit him like a physical blow. Not as the kennel keeper, not as nobody important. I would rather freeze out here than go back to being invisible. Kale stared at her. Then come back as something else. She looked up at him sharply. As what? He didn't have an answer for that either, not yet. But the ache behind his ribs had settled into something warm and steady and patient, and he found he could breathe again. Stay tonight, he said. Let us feed you. Let us tend to Fenric. And in the morning, if you still want to stay out here, I will leave and I won't come back. Sable searched his face for a long time, looking for the lie, looking for the catch. She didn't find one. One night, she said. Kale exhaled. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a door left open by exactly 1 inch, and he intended to make that inch count. They made camp in the hollow as the light faded, the guards pitching tents and building a proper fire while Sable tended to Fenric with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been caring for wolves since she was 17. She didn't let anyone else touch him. She mixed a thin broth from dried meat and water, warming it by the fire until it steamed, and held the bowl under the wolf's nose until his nostrils flared and something ancient and instinctive overrode the stubbornness that had been starving him for nearly 2 weeks. He drank. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, his tongue working the bowl clean, while Sable steadied it with both hands. When it was empty, she made more. Kale watched from across the fire, his chest aching with something he was only beginning to understand. Not guilt, though there was plenty of that. Something deeper. An awareness that had been growing in him for months, maybe years, that this woman was woven into the fabric of his life in ways he had refused to examine and could no longer ignore. The pulling sensation in his chest confirmed it. It had started as a vague discomfort, grown into a directional ache, and now, sitting 12 feet from her in the firelight, had settled into a steady, resonant hum that matched her breathing. When she moved, the hum shifted. When she spoke, it deepened. When she glanced in his direction, which she did rarely and briefly, it flared bright enough to make him catch his breath. He knew what it was. Every alpha knew the stories, the old accounts of a bond so deep it bypassed thought and reason and operated on the level of blood and bone. A connection that, once recognized, could not be unrecognized. A mate bond. And he was almost certain she had no idea. The fire burned low. The guards rotated shifts. Sable stayed beside Fenric, her hand resting on his flank, her eyes fixed on the dying flames. She hadn't eaten anything herself, Kale noticed, even though her own supplies were thin and the guards had offered food twice. You should eat, he said. I'm fine. You're not fine. You've been surviving on preserved meat and whatever you could forage from the moor for 12 days. Eat. She glanced at him, and for a moment the hard shell cracked and he saw something underneath. Exhaustion so deep it had settled into her bones like weather. "Is that a royal command?" she asked, and there was the faintest trace of dark humor in her voice, the first he had heard since arriving. "If it needs to be," Cale replied. She ate. Not much, but enough. And when sleep finally took her, she curled against Fenric's side with one hand fisted in his fur, and even in sleep her grip didn't loosen, as though she was afraid the wolf would disappear if she let go. Cale didn't sleep. He sat beside the fire and watched the fog shift and curl around the edges of the camp, and he thought about what he would say in the morning. How do you convince someone to come home when you're the reason they left? How do you ask for trust from a person whose trust you shattered with 3 careless words? He was still thinking when dawn broke thin and gray over the moor. Sable woke with the light. She sat up, pressed her palm against Fenric's chest to check his heartbeat, and seemed satisfied by what she felt. Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her clothes, and looked at Cale with an expression that was calm, resolved, and completely devastating. "Thank you for the food," she said, "and for coming, truly. But I meant what I said." Cale's chest constricted. "Sable, I'm not coming back as a ghost," she said firmly. "I spent 6 years building something in those kennels. 6 years of my life, my work, my heart. And none of it mattered. Not to the council, not to the court, not to you. I heard it from your own mouth." "You mattered," Cale said, rising to his feet. "You have always mattered." "Then why didn't you say so?" Her voice rose for the first time, and the crack in it ran deep. "One word, Your Majesty. In 6 years, one word would have been enough. My name, just my name, spoken like it belonged to a person instead of a function." Cale felt the impact of that deep in his chest, right where the ache had lived. She was right. He knew she was right. And the worst part was that he had known it even then, standing in that doorway watching her save his wolf, and he had walked away anyway, because acknowledging her would have cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. "I know," he said, "and I am sorry. Not as your king. As the man who should have said your name 1,000 times and didn't." The silence that followed was long enough for the fog to shift direction. Sable's jaw trembled. She pressed her mouth into a hard line and turned away, walking toward her shelter, and Cale felt the pulling in his chest wrench sideways like something tearing. Then she stopped. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders rigid, her hands clenched at her sides. The wind moved through the hollow, cold and smelling of peat. "Something is wrong with me," she said, her voice smaller than he had ever heard it. "Since I left the castle. Something is wrong, and I don't know what it is." Cale went very still. "I can't sleep," she continued, not turning around. "I can't eat properly. My chest hurts constantly, right here." She pressed her fist against her sternum. "Like something is dragging me south. Dragging me back. And when you arrived yesterday and I saw you standing there, the pain just stopped. And that terrifies me because it means the pain is connected to you, and I don't understand why." Cale's heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his temples. She was describing the bond. She was describing exactly what he had been feeling. The same ache, the same direction, the same relief at proximity. "I feel it too," he said quietly. Sable turned around. Her eyes were wide, her composure crumbling at the edges. "What?" "The pulling. The ache when we're apart. The way it goes quiet when we're close." He swallowed hard. "I've felt it for months. I didn't know what it was until you left, and then it became so loud I couldn't hear anything else." She stared at him, her face a war between hope and fear. "What is it?" she whispered. And Cale, who had spent his entire life choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that language was power, said the truest and most terrifying thing he had ever said. "It's a mate bond. You and I are bonded." The color drained from Sable's face. She took a step back, then another. Her hand pressed against her chest, her breathing rapid and shallow. No, she said. That's not possible. Sable. Kings don't bond with kennel keepers, she said, and the words came out ragged and desperate. That's not how it works. Bonds form between equals, between wolves of standing and rank. I'm a foundling. I'm nobody. Don't, Kale said sharply, crossing the distance between them in 3 strides. Don't call yourself that. Not ever. He stopped in front of her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off her skin, close enough that the hum in his chest became a roar. She looked up at him with those dark, honest eyes, and the fear in them was so raw it made his chest split open. I called you nobody important, he said, and it was the worst lie I have ever told. She didn't speak for a long time after that. She stood in front of him, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt like being read down to the bone. Kale let her look. He had spent years hiding behind the mask of kingship, controlling what people saw, managing every expression and inflection and silence. He let all of it drop. He let her see exactly what was underneath. The guilt, the longing, the fear, and the absolute certainty that what he was telling her was true. A mate bond, she repeated, her voice flat, testing the words the way you might test the weight of a loaded weapon. Yes. And you've known for how long? I suspected for months. I knew for certain the day you disappeared. She flinched. So you came after me because of the bond, because it was pulling you, not because— No, Kale interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. He softened it deliberately, forcing himself to slow down. I came after you because when I stood in the empty kennels and saw your apron was gone, I realized that the most important person in my household had vanished, and I had never once told her she was important. The bond showed me the direction. The rest was mine. Something shifted in her expression. Not softening, not yet, but a slight loosening around the edges, like a fist unclenching one finger at a time. I can't just come back, she said. You understand that, don't you? I can't walk through those gates and go back to the kennels and pretend everything is fine. The court will eat me alive. They already looked through me when I was invisible. What do you think they'll do when they find out the king's bonded mate is the orphan who cleaned up after his wolves? I don't care what they do, Kale said. You should. You're a king. You have to care. I'm also a man who hasn't slept in 12 days because his wolf was dying, and the only person who could help was gone because of something cruel he said without thinking. I'm done caring about what the court thinks. Sable's eyes filled with tears, the first she had allowed since he arrived. She pressed the heels of her hands against them hard, as if she could push them back in through sheer force of will. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know how to be anything other than useful. My whole life, the only thing that kept me safe was being needed, being quiet and essential, and never asking for anything. And now you're standing here telling me I'm your mate, and I have no idea what that means for someone like me. Kale reached out slowly, the way you would approach a frightened animal, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers found hers, and the moment their skin touched, the humming in his chest exploded into something so intense it stole his breath. He felt her gasp, felt her fingers tighten around his like a reflex she couldn't control. It means you're not invisible anymore, he said. It means I see you. All of you. Not the kennel keeper, not the foundling, not the function. You. A tear slid down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily with her free hand. And if I come back and nothing changes? She asked. If the court whispers and the council disapproves, and you get tired of defending someone nobody thinks is worthy? Then we'll burn it all down, Kale said simply. The smallest smile cracked across her face, involuntary and gone almost immediately. But he saw it. He saw it, and it hit him like sunlight breaking through the fog. That seems drastic, she said. I'm known for drastic, he replied. She laughed, a short, choked sound that was half sob, and the wall behind her eyes fractured. Not shattered, not yet, but fractured enough that he could see through the cracks to the woman underneath, the one who had poured her heart into his wolves and asked for nothing. The one who had walked into the Ashen Moor alone rather than spend another day being invisible. "One condition," she said, squeezing his hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "You never call me nobody again. Not to a dignitary, not to a servant, not to yourself. Never." "Never," Cale swore, and meant it with every fractured piece of himself. The fog around them had begun to thin. Weak sunlight filtered through, turning the gray moor gold at the edges, and Fenric lifted his head from where he lay, his ears pricked forward, his tail thumping once against the ground like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. Sable looked down at the wolf, then back at Cale, and the expression on her face was the most frightening thing she had ever worn. It was trust. Fragile, conditional, terrified trust, offered like a lit candle in a windstorm. "Take me home," she said. The ride back took 2 days. They traveled slowly, Fenric too weak to keep pace with the horses. Sable walked beside the wolf for most of the first day, murmuring to him in the low, steady voice that Cale was beginning to realize could calm anything, wolf or king, or the emptiness that had lived in his chest since she vanished. That first night, camped at the edge of the thornwood, Sable settled near the flames and Cale took a seat across from her, and neither of them spoke about the bond or the court or what waited for them at the castle. Instead, Sable told him about the moor, about the silence that had nearly broken her the first 3 nights, so total and absolute it felt like the world had forgotten she existed. About the morning she woke to find a wild fox curled against her feet. About the first time she caught a fish in the moorland stream with her bare hands and sat on the bank, laughing at herself because there was no one to see it. Cale listened. He listened the way he should have been listening all along, with his full attention, with the weight of his gaze and the silence that told her every word she said mattered. When she finally fell quiet, he said, "I want to know everything. Every day I missed. Every day I wasted." Sable looked at him across the fire, and the distrust in her eyes had softened to something cautious and watchful, the way Fenric had watched her from across the kennel on that very first day, wanting to trust, but not quite daring to. "Then ask," she said. On the second night, Sable woke from a dead sleep gasping, her body drenched in sweat, a scream dying in her throat. Cale was beside her in an instant, his hands hovering, not touching, remembering that she hadn't given him permission for that yet. "I'm fine," she managed, pressing her palm against her chest. "Just a dream." But her face was ashen, and her pupils were blown wide, and the bond between them was screaming with a frequency he had never felt before. Something cold and alien that didn't belong to either of them. "What did you see?" he asked. Sable shook her head. "Nothing. Fog. Darkness." She swallowed. "Something watching." Cale went very still. "It was just a dream," she said again, but her voice had no conviction in it at all. Fenric, who had finally been sleeping soundly, raised his head and stared into the dark trees surrounding their camp. A low, continuous growl rumbled from his chest, his hackles rising in a ridge along his spine. He was staring at nothing, or at something neither of them could see. The dream came again the next night, and the night after that. Each time it was the same. Fog so thick it had weight. Silence so complete it had teeth. And somewhere in the dark, something patient and aware, drawing closer with every visit. By the time they reached the castle gates, Sable had not slept properly in 2 days, and the shadows under her eyes matched the ones Cale carried. The bond between them hummed with a shared exhaustion that made it hard to tell whose fatigue belonged to whom. The court reacted to her arrival exactly as she had predicted. Whispers trailed her through the corridors like smoke. Counselor Marin's expression when she saw Sable walking beside the king could have curdled milk at 20 paces. But Cale kept his hand at the small of her back, steady and deliberate and visible, and nobody said a word to her face. That night, in the king's chambers, Sable sat on the edge of the bed she had been given and stared at the fire. Fenric lay at her feet, recovered enough to eat and walk, but still thin, still watchful, still pressing himself against her legs whenever she was still for more than a minute. "The dreams," she said without looking at Kale. "They're getting worse." "Tell me," he said. She told him. The fog, the circling presence, and a new element, a voice low and shapeless, whispering words she couldn't quite make out. Words that felt like accusations. Kale's face went pale. "You hear it too," she said, reading him instantly. "You've been hearing it." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "Since the night you left. Every time I close my eyes, it tells me things about myself. Things that are true. Things I don't want to hear." "What kind of things?" His jaw tightened. "That I'm the reason people leave. That I destroy the things I should be protecting. That everyone I've ever failed to see, to value, to hold on to, is proof that I don't deserve to hold anything at all." The words fell like stones into still water. Sable watched the ripples move across his face, the way his hands gripped the arms of the chair, the way his breathing went shallow and controlled in the manner of someone who had been holding something back for a very long time. "That's not a dream," she said slowly. "That's a curse." Kale looked at her sharply. "I grew up in the kennels," she continued, her voice steady now, gaining the quiet authority of someone fitting pieces together. "Wolves carry curses in their bloodlines. I've seen it. A wolf who was beaten will flinch at raised hands for the rest of its life. Its pups will flinch too, even if they were never struck. The wound passes down. It lives in the blood." She leaned forward. "Something wounded you long before you met me. Long before the war. Before the crown. And whatever it was, it left something behind. Something that feeds on guilt. Something that tells you, every night, that you are not enough." Neither of them breathed. Kale's eyes were bright and raw, stripped of every defense. She had reached into the center of him and named the thing he had never been able to name himself. "My father," he said, and the word came out like it had been pulled from somewhere deep and locked. "He never spoke to me directly, not once in 18 years. Everything went through advisors, through Brennick's predecessor, through the council. I was a function to him, an heir, a purpose, not a person." His voice cracked. "He called my mother nobody important the day she left the castle. Those exact words. I was 9 years old, and I stood in the corridor and heard him say it, and I swore I would never become him." The recognition hit Sable like a wave, the same words, the same corridor, the same wound, passed down like a curse in the blood. "You became him," she whispered, not cruelly, but with the devastating gentleness of someone who understood exactly how much that truth cost. "I became him," Kale confirmed. And the confession broke something open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 20 years. His eyes filled. He didn't look away. He let her see it. Every fracture, every failure, every night spent listening to a voice that told him he was built wrong, made wrong, that the capacity to love had been left out of him the way it had been left out of his father. Sable stood. She crossed the space between them, knelt in front of his chair, and took his face in her roughened, wind-chapped hands. "You are not him," she said. "You crossed a wasteland to find me. You stood in front of your council and said my name. You called yourself a coward because you knew it was true, and your father would have died before admitting weakness." She pressed her forehead against his. "The curse is a liar. You are not your father's son in the ways that matter. You are the man who came to find me." Kale's hands came up to cover hers, his shoulders shook, and in the quiet of his chambers, with the fire burning low and Fenric watching from the foot of the bed, the Alpha King wept for the first time since he was 9 years old. Sable held him through it. She held him the way she had held Fenric on that winter night, with steady hands and a low, constant voice, and the unshakable patience of someone who understood that the only way out of old pain was through it. The fog in his dreams receded that night. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Enough to let him sleep without the voice. Enough to let the silence be silence again, instead of a held breath waiting to speak. In the morning, he woke to find her beside him, her hand still resting on his chest, her breathing slow and even. Fenric lay across the foot of the bed, his nose tucked under his tail, sleeping deeply. Kale lay still and watched the dawn light crawl across the ceiling, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the morning felt like a beginning instead of an escape from the night. The court never fully warmed to her. There were always whispers, always sideways glances from nobles who believed the king's mate should have come with a bloodline and a dowry, rather than calloused hands and the smell of cedar oil. But Kale had kept his word. He never called her nobody again. He spoke her name in council meetings, at diplomatic dinners, at the Northern Summit he had nearly missed. He spoke it clearly and with the unmistakable weight of a man who had decided that this was the hill he would die on. The dreams didn't stop all at once. Some nights the fog crept back, and the voice whispered, and Kale would wake rigid and breathing hard. But Sable was always there. She would press her hand against his chest, right over the place where the pulling had lived, and wait until his breathing slowed, until the fog released him, until his hand found hers in the dark. Fenric recovered fully within a month. His coat grew back thick and glossy, his appetite returned with a vengeance, and he resumed his position as the most feared and least approachable wolf in the royal kennels. He still only ate from a copper bowl, he still only allowed his left ear to be scratched. And he still slept at the foot of their bed every night, a warm, heavy anchor at the border between waking and dreaming. The whispers faded, not because the court had changed its mind, but because Sable had proven herself impossible to dismiss. She reorganized the kennels into something the huntsman couldn't take credit for anymore. She stood beside Kale at formal events with her chin raised and her dark eyes daring anyone in the room to call her nobody. Nobody ever did. On a cold morning in early spring, Sable woke to pale light filtering through the curtains and the steady rhythm of Kale's breathing beside her. His arm was draped across her waist. Fenric was snoring at the foot of the bed. The castle was quiet, the corridors still, the wolves in the kennels below sleeping soundly in dens she had built with her own hands. She pressed her palm against Kale's chest, felt the heartbeat, strong and even, felt the bond between them, warm and steady and quiet. No fog, no voice, no pulling, just peace. Hard-won and imperfect and entirely theirs. Sable closed her eyes, settled into the warmth of him, and slept.